Welcome to the Virtual CPA Success Show, where we're 100% focused on helping service-based businesses achieve success. Are you a business owner interested in learning how to scale your business? Has your business reached over $1 million in annual revenue? Then this podcast is for you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast. Today, we're going to dig a little bit deeper on a podcast that we just released. So our last released podcast was on forecasting for revenue growth. So it just shows you how quickly times can change because obviously, since we recorded that podcast, we're living in a completely different world with this coronavirus out there. So we're going to kind of take that to the other extent. How would you do a forecast if you have an emergency or if the economy is looking low or if you just have a problem with sales? So this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, forecasting for the opposite of growth, forecasting for down times. So Jody, let's just throw it over to you right away and start about, if I'm a digital agency and I know time's looking slow, what should I do and how should that affect my forecast?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Well, it's not funny, but it is ironic that we were just talking about the opposite just a few weeks ago. And times have changed dramatically since then. And the unique thing is I've gone through, I don't typically have a client base myself, but I've sat in and helped out with many CFO calls, and we've done just exactly this modeling that we're talking about today. And we've done it several times, even with the same clients, to get to where they're happy and satisfied and give that comfort feeling to where, because when it comes down to it, it's a comfort feeling. You've got to be able to know, hey, where am I going as a leader? What's the company looking like? What are the different scenarios out there that can really make things, spin on, a company spin on its, on its ends type of thing. And so this is huge, a huge part of what you as a leader need to make sure that you do is just hop in and start scenario planning. And to break it down, it's very simple. It's simple in a way that if you have the modeling already put together, so that you can look at the first thing you look at is your revenue on your forecasting side. Then you're going to look at your expenses, and then you're going to break out and kind of make sure they're in the right mold. So, starting with the revenue side, that what you're looking at here is delays in projects. Delays, clients maybe pausing things for a little bit, maybe clients not paying timely. All the different scenarios that may happen. You've kind of walked through them right now and kind of plan that out. And so, what we've done is we've asked clients to kind of list their, the clients out that are in really bad shape. Maybe thinking that, hey, maybe these clients might go away. The clients that are solid, no issues at all, humming right along, no issues there. Or maybe even the clients that their clients may be impacted in some way. So kind of looking in the crystal ball a little bit and seeing, hey, which clients do we think, may kind of fade away? And we've done the same thing with our base. Which clients are the most impacted? Well, the clients that can't do business, like the restaurants, the barbershops, the salons, all those different, clients that really can't do anything. The clients that are the opposite would be the clients that have, maybe are working for the food industry or more, in the grocery store industry, or maybe, doing dev and design for, the healthcare industry, all the different ones that we know, hey, those are a little bit more safer clients. So we've done the exact same thing. And so the first thing is identifying, what you think is going to happen over these next 2 to 3 months, because that's really what we're looking at right away is the 2 to 3 month look, because really any further than that's just pretty much guessing at that point.
I think the important thing here, just to slow it down a little bit, is on the revenue side, what I've been doing is to really, a lot of times when I'm doing revenue forecasting, I do it at a pretty high level. I build the pipeline. I show what the revenue looks like for the next 3 months. If it looks good, okay, we're in good shape. We don't need to look at this forecast again in this detail for another month. But I think what I've been doing with my clients, and I've seen other people do it with their clients as well, is to break down that revenue by customer and exactly go detail by detail, line by line, and say, okay, let's build a best case scenario. Let's build a best case scenario of what revenue could be if no one leaves, and go through our pipeline and figure out which ones are going to sign with us. And then from there, you kind of build the other scenarios. But I think the biggest thing you can go into that detail a little bit more, Jody, but I think the other thing here to remember is when times are tough, I've been looking at pipeline and looking at my forecast every single week with my clients. Mm-hmm. And so it's like a monthly thing, but this time when times are rough, it's every week to see how things have changed. So again, that's the one thing I want to throw out there, is that this is a thing during these tough times. You want to make sure you're looking at it more frequently than normal, because things do change that quickly, as we've all seen.
Oh, for sure. And so it's really important to, like Jamie said, to go through and look and make sure that this is a very fluid, dynamic forecast that we're looking at. Again, something that you can model and something you can change, not just writing on a piece of paper and trying to figure it out. Otherwise, it'll drive you pretty much batty. So with that forecast, once you've identified the revenue over the next 3 months, then you've got to look and see how's that really going to impact, cash. Is cash still okay? Do we still have that 10% reserve? Or are we getting to a point where we only have maybe one payroll in the bank or something that's a little bit more scarier as a business owner? So we have to kind of look at the cash impact that it immediately has. And so then at that point, if we're okay with that impact, then we look at the dynamics of how the year is going to end out. Are we going to end out being, now a negative 5% or negative 10% because of the big hit here? And that's really not acceptable. So if that's the case, then we have to really do a lot of juggling, of our different areas. And so when we talk about the areas that we focus on, we look at the two big ones, which would be your gross profit margin and then your overhead. And your overhead consists of the facility, marketing, and admin costs. And we typically want to see the overhead total, and which also includes most of the owner's salary, at that 35% mark, no more than that. And then on the production side, we want to see that at about the 15% mark, and really no more than that, which leaves that 15% net income. So we want to build our model back to the 15% net income. So going through this, if we decide, hey, we're going to lose maybe two or big clients, and that's going to really put a big damper on things on the net income. And it takes us from a projected 20% down to 5% or maybe 0 or whatever that percentage might be. Then we need to look and say, okay, now what do we need to cut or we need to reduce back or we need to control a little bit more on the expense side? In the first place you look, obviously, is your production side. Do we have too many producers at this point that can manage the lighter load? And it might come down to, well, I don't know. It's like I don't have that crystal ball. I don't know. So what do I do? Well, unfortunately, you got to look back and see how much cash you have. And so if you have a lot of cash, you've got the luxury at this point to kind of ride it out a little bit and see how things kind of shake out. If you don't have cash, then you don't have that luxury. You got to make some really tough decisions on how can I scale back my team so that I'm back within the balance there, at 50% gross profit margin. So it might be cutting back a couple for developers, designers, whatever might not have as much impact on your overall product. And it's a good time really to kind of scale back and look at your team and start reevaluating your team. Hey, who are the people that really aren't cutting it? Maybe I need to let that person sit on the sideline for a little bit. Maybe bring them back after this all shakes out. That type of thing. So it's a revision, basically just you're revising your forecast. And the important thing is that I want to stress is that don't revise it to a 0 or a very small profit margin, because you're very rarely going to hit that. So you want to make sure you revise it to something that that after this year is over, you're going to say, well, that wasn't too bad. I made the adjustment. Maybe it's 15% or 12% or 20% if you're used to a higher profit margin. So make sure that you come back to reality with that profit margin. Don't just accept a 10% or a 5% profit margin. What can I do to rebalance it? And typically it's the production, but once you do all your calculations and you find out that, well, maybe my overhead's a little too high, well, you're part of the overhead, so maybe you cut your salary back a little bit to bring it in. Or if you find that, hey, we don't need to be spending as much in marketing, or we don't need to be spending much in admin, maybe it's time to cut back some of your admin costs, whether that's an admin person or different things that generate your business. So you've got to really kind of keep rejuggling your plan to come back to reality, come back to that 15%. And the companies that really, I think, really going to come out of this strong is the companies that actually do this. They don't just let things happen, but they really do truly focus on how can I make my company not exactly where I was beforehand, because that's going to be tough, but make my company end up with a pretty solid overall year.
Great. So I think, Joe, what I'd like to do here, and I think this might be an interesting way to talk through this, is why don't I walk through with you what I did with one of my clients as an example? Mm-hmm. Because I think having a client just hear us walk through one of these, and then you can kind of like chime in on things that I'm talking about and give a little bit more context. I think that might be a really helpful way for us to walk through this.
Great idea.
Okay, so the client I'm thinking of, is a client that traditionally has about 30% of revenue in the bank. So they're usually really good on their cash reserves. In January, They paid some pretty large bonuses. And they paid their profit sharing out in January. So their cash reserve was still good. It was still around 20%, but this is a company that's used to carrying close to 30% cash reserves. So that's just a little bit of baseline of where this company was at in terms of cash when this whole coronavirus thing kind of hit. So that's just a starting point. So the way I look at that is obviously they have enough cash in the bank to wait and see a little bit. They didn't have, they're still, from a ownership standpoint, he was probably a little impatient because he's used to having 30% in the bank. So he was a little nervous, but he was agreeing that we could wait a little bit in terms of what the next 3 months were going to look like. The first thing we did was we looked at their existing contracts. So we looked at all of their existing projects, and let's say there were 12 of them. We walked through all 12 of them one by one and said, okay, have you had any conversations with client 1? Have you had any conversations with client 2? And after we did that, they had conversations with all their clients, and there were 2 clients that we knew for sure were ending, and there were 2 that we were a little worried about that they were going to pause services on. So we documented that, and basically for the 2 we knew were ending, we took those out of the best case scenario. For the 2 that were possibly ending, we left them in best case scenario, but took them out of worst case scenario. And so we built a scenario based on their existing projects first. So any thoughts or context on that, Jody, I should add, or does that make sense?
No, that's great. Yeah, you broke it into 3 different buckets or 2 different buckets, and whatever many different buckets that you needed to do to bring that to fact. Yeah, that's exactly what I've done.
Okay, great. So the next thing we did was we looked at their pipeline. So we looked at their pipeline and we went project by project and said, okay, how do you feel about these projects? And then what we did is we identified the ones that we feel like that might close in the next 3 months. Everything else we threw out the door, and said, okay, we can talk about those later, but I'm only concerned about the ones that will close and you'll earn revenue over these next 3 months. And then for all of those pipeline projects, we basically said, okay, what do you think your chances are of winning them? High, medium, or low? Anything that was high, we threw in we started with all of them. So we put all of them in the best case scenario, high, medium, or low. Every one of these projects were in the best case scenario situation. Then we created that middle realistic case scenario where we pulled out all of the low cases. So anything they thought that they really didn't have a good chance of winning, I pulled out of that realistic case. And then I created a worst case where I pulled out the ones where they identified as, yeah, we could really well win these, but I'm not certain on those. And so I basically, after I had that, I had 3 different buckets of revenue for the next 3 months. I had my best case scenario, assuming we close everything and we don't lose anything but the ones we know we're losing. I have my realistic case, which is we know we're going to close these because we feel very confident. We've had conversations with them. The medium ones, we hope we win, but we're not certain on yet. And then the worst case scenario had those low ones in there, which could close in the next 3 months, but we're not feeling great about. So I kind of had 3 scenarios of revenue for the next 3 months of what they could look like.
How did you include like the bohemian clients, like the big $1 million deal that doesn't come around very often? How did you include that into your buckets?
Yeah, so they had a handful of those. And so I really just pressed them on it. I talked about them. I said, okay, this $1 million project, obviously, we're going to win it, but how much revenue of that, or how do you feel about it? And they said, yeah, we think we're going to win it. And I'm like, okay, if you do win it, how much revenue do you get over these next 3 months? So I didn't put all of that revenue in the next 3 months. I only took the portion that they're going to earn over the next 3 months and put it in there. But this company had a really good sense of their pipeline. And that if they don't, what I would have done is I would have said, hey, go make some calls, go have some conversations, and let's meet tomorrow, or let's meet the next day. Because I don't want them going to this conversation doing a lot of guessing, because that makes it a lot harder to have. And so luckily, when I had this conversation with the client, they were really aware of what was going on in their pipeline and what each of those projects meant to them. Make sense?
Oh, it makes complete sense. So what did you do next then?
Yeah, so after that, what I did was I had 3 revenue scenarios for them. So what I did to that is I took their expenses as they've existed in the past and as we were forecasting, and I put them compared to next to all 3 of those scenarios. Obviously, the best case scenario was resulting in some pretty strong revenue for the next 3 months. It was resulting in 30% profits, cash was growing, and these next 3 months were going to be really strong. Our realistic scenario was a little worse than that. It was closer to 10 to 15% for a company that's used to earning 20%. Obviously, that wasn't great for them. They weren't too excited about it, but considering they had cash reserve in place and they were a pretty strong company over the last 12 months, they were okay with it, not great with it. The worst case scenario was a break even or a loss over these next 3 months. So that freaked the company out. They didn't love that example. And so what we did is for each of those scenarios, we kind of talked about what cost savings we could have. Best case scenario, just keep doing business as is. We can handle a 30% profit over these next 3 months if that's what happens. Middle case scenario, realistic scenario, let's try to get that 15% to a 20%. So what they decided was they had a couple of production employees that were contractors, actually not employees, contractors, that they were paying to do projects that they probably could replace those contractors with full-time people they already had on staff, save the cost, and get closer to 20%. So that's what we decided was if we are in this realistic case scenario, then that's what we would do is we would remove those contractors and replace that work with more of the employees that are long-term and here for the long run. That was the realistic.
So it sounds like basically what you did is you're planning for the different scenarios. So like,
Exactly.
you're not just taking one scenario and saying, hey, the sky is falling. Let's let all our people go because we're going to have a horrible next 3 months, because you really don't know that.
100%.
You didn't take that scenario, but you did basically based on that scenario. If we did have that scenario, what would we actually do?
Exactly.
Are we going to do these X, Y, Z, these things? And then you also did the same thing on the great scenario. If everything goes really well, here's what we're going to do. We're not planning necessarily for everything to go well, but we're scenario planning. We're 100%. Not in the bad scenario or not in the great scenario. We don't know. And maybe the middle scenario is where it ends up. And so I think what you're doing, and you're trying to teach the client that, is that, hey, you've got to have an outlook on all three scenarios. 100%. Hey, here's how we manage this company. If this happens, here's what we do. If this happens, here's what we do.
Exactly. Yeah, because like you said, in the worst case scenario, that was even worse. It was getting rid of contractors, and they had 3 or 4 employees that they were developing, but weren't quite there yet, and they weren't exactly working out. And if we were in that worst case scenario, we'd have to let those people go. And exactly to your point, I think the best thing you can do during these rough times is be prepared to pull the trigger quickly. And so what we did is once we had this built, we just sat back and waited. And every week when we met, I said, okay, has anything changed? Let's look at the best case, realistic case, and worst case. If any of these things triggered, that happened. And honestly, what happened with this company, luckily, is a lot of those deals that were in the low started signing. They started signing some of these low deals. They started signing the medium deals. So we were leaning a lot more towards this best case scenario where they didn't have to do anything. Where if I met with them in week 2 and they said, well, Jamie, these 2 medium deals didn't sign that we thought we're going to, we probably have to start talking about, okay, it's probably time to start having this conversation with those contractors right now. Instead of deciding that at the time, those decisions were already made. So you can react very quickly. And if they would have happened on a Monday and I was going to meet with the client on a Thursday, and he couldn't get hold of me for some reason, he could easily make those decisions because we already talked about them. We already talked about if these 2 deals don't sign, you're going to have to get rid of your contractor. So he could have done that without even talking to me as a CFO. Again, I wanted to call me. I wanted to Slack me. I wanted to get hold of me. But the biggest thing is being prepared to act quickly, which most companies that don't do forecasting aren't prepared to do.
Yeah. So basically, you just took the emotion completely out of the decision-making process, which a lot of people fall guilty in that, especially when things really start happening with the closures of the businesses and with the quarantining and all that. People just, clients are like, oh my gosh, the world's coming to an end. What do I do? Do I let everybody go? What do I do? And it's more or less just sitting down and kind of going through that forecast and kind of showing them, like Jamie was saying, just building each scenario out and saying, hey, we're not in any of these 3 scenarios yet. You haven't lost one client yet.
Right.
You may never lose a client. And they're like, well, but all clients, we're going to lose a ton. People aren't going to be able to, and they start rationalizing why they're going to lose a ton and why things are going to go, the way they are. Just like people do on the opposite side and say, hey, we're going to win every deal. You get the opposite effect too with people. So you kind of sit down and take that emotion out and kind of just go through the scenario planning. Well, let's go through the scenario planning if you lose everybody. Okay, well, here's what happens. Let's go through the scenario planning where you start picking clients up. Here's what happens. And when you do that, when you go through that scenario planning, you really do take that emotion completely out of the picture, and you can kind of sit back and kind of relax a little bit, knowing that, hey, yeah, I guess, even if things do go bad, if you plan it out, we can still make it through here with not a problem. It's not going to be the same exact company that we started with, but we're going to have a viable company. It's going to be a company that's going to continue on year over year, which is very, very important.
Yeah. And I think the other part of it too, that was great about having someone to have these conversations with. Again, if you don't have a CFO, maybe pulling in your ops person or pulling in other people in the business to have these conversations it's crazy the ideas that come up. Having a 1-person conversation just sitting there with a spreadsheet is going to be all your thoughts, but having someone to talk to about really helps. And so I think I'm using a different company here, but one company, I did this exact same thing that I was talking about. They had a little less cash situation in place, so it was a little bit more difficult. But one of the things he brought up right away is, let's look through our expenses in detail and we were able to pull out all of their meals and entertainment, all of those costs that they were spending on keeping the kitchen stocked in the office, all of their rent costs. They got rent forgiveness for 2 months. So we were able to pull out some of those costs automatically because we knew they weren't going to happen over the next 3 months. And so that made the all three scenarios look a little better. And we didn't really have to go down the person cutting lane yet unless we got into that worst case scenario. So it's great to have multiple people in on this conversation because more heads are greater than one. We're going to think of lots of different ideas of ways to save costs. So.
Yeah, and how do you take into consideration with a lot of people qualifying, getting funding now for the PPP loan? How do you take that into consideration? What are you telling clients?
Yeah, so I think we built that into the best case scenario, right? So like we didn't early on when we started these conversations, we didn't know much about these PPP loans. Like we knew that their application was going to happen. We didn't know exactly how much. We didn't know if there was going to be forgiveness, but we knew that companies would qualify. Once we started knowing more, we started moving it into the different buckets. Maybe we moved it from the worst case into the middle case. But the important thing when you're doing that is you have to be forecasting the balance sheet as well. So if I would just throw it in the income statement and say, oh yeah, we're going to get a $400,000 loan in February or March or April, whenever that came through, if I threw that in there and just said, oh, look.
If anybody got in February, raise your hand.
Yeah. Very lucky ones. No one. Yeah, of course. So you throw it in, if I would just throw it into 1 month of outlook, then obviously it would affect that month's income statement, but you wouldn't know what it would do to your balance sheet. So you have to throw it under the balance sheet and say, okay, if we get a $400,000 loan on April 30th, how's cash going to look at each of those months? And so I could say, okay, look, I'm going to have $1 million in cash in April. Now it's going to be 800 in May, and it'll be down to 600 in June. I can handle that. If I don't get that loan, obviously it's going to be a lot tighter than that. So it's about forecasting the balance sheet, which I know we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And so, like Jamie said, we tell people, hey, you really need to build that into your forecast, but don't build it in all three, because the worst case scenario could, and you have the worst case scenario until you actually have the money in the bank from those loans,
Yeah.
Even if you're approved and you're, whatever, until you have money in the bank, you don't spend it. That's something that's really, really important to understand and to remember. Even if the bank say, hey, you're approved, you don't spend that money until you actually have it in the bank. And so once it's in the bank, then you're basically just moved from worst case scenario, just changed completely. Yep. So now that's not worst case scenario anymore. So again, I think what Jamie would probably say is, well, but then we go back and we have 3 more scenarios now.
100%.
Here's the worst case scenarios out of this one, and what's the middle and what's the best, and continue through that whole process until you're completely out of the woods there. But, over those next 3 weeks, it's going to be really important that you take full advantage of that loan if you get it. If you get it, make sure that the money is being spent towards employees. Make sure that you're tracking those expenses. Make sure that you've got, the other 25% going to the rent, utilities, and or rent and, interest, mortgage interest, that sort of thing. Make sure that's being documented well so that you can take full advantage of that when it comes out of the cycle. Because keep in mind, if you lose employees during that time, you're not going to get as much forgiven as you would if you maintain your employees or increase your employees at that point. So it's important to understand how the loan actually works, because again, it is a loan until it gets forgiven. So keep that in mind when you're going through it. It's not free money until it is actually forgiven. So make sure you meet all the qualifications for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that's what, if you're listening to this podcast, you're already very involved in your business and invest in your business. I think taking a couple extra steps to research that forgiveness. I know the banks have come out with quite a bit of guidance on it, but all the official guidance isn't there quite yet. But again, on what that forgiveness is going to look like, you need to calculate it to make sure you get the most forgiveness you can. And so obviously, if you thought you were going to get rid of half your employees and still get full forgiveness, then that's obviously you need to think through that a little bit more and maybe adjust your plans and say, okay, we still need to cut costs, but for every employee cost we cut, we're going to get less of this forgiveness. So maybe we need to think about some other things. Is there other things we can cut costs on, because every employee you cut is going to decrease that percentage that you'll get forgiven. So
yeah, or maybe you're in the opposite side and you're thinking, hey, do I want to bring on somebody, and typically bring on a contractor maybe for the first few times? Well, bring them on as an employee. You might as well. You're going to get some benefit for it, where the government will basically pay for that for the next 8 weeks. And so, take advantage of that opportunity too. If you're in a situation where you're in a potential growing stage or a potential increasing staff for whatever reason, definitely take advantage of it for sure.
Right. So I'm gonna throw our email address out there. I know, again, you can reach out to us for podcast topics. You can reach out for us with questions, and especially when it comes to this PPP loan and all of the CARES Act, like we've been doing a lot of research on it. So if you want to reach out to Jody or I, you can make sure to get that information. So our email address is vcfo@summit SUMMITCPA.net. Again, the email address vcfo@summitcpa.net. Reach out to us for anything. We really don't mind helping people through these tough times and answering questions. Like we're doing it for all of our clients. So we have a lot of answers at our fingertips. So feel free to email us. And then as always, if you have any topic recommendations for us or anything you want to be a guest on the show, you can email that account. So
yeah, for sure.
Any final thoughts, Jody?
I would say kind of in closing here, I think, looking at this as an opportunity, I think is the way that you really need to look at this whole thing, because it is truly an opportunity for you to right-size your ship. It's an opportunity for you to really dig in and make sure that your business is going as well as it needs to go. And if it's not, cutting the fat at this point so that it brings it back up. So I think a lot of companies are kind of come out. Those that are managed well are going to come out of this very strong, even if they do have a big hit in sales. Sales isn't the driver there; it's the net income and what you can bring to the bottom line with the cash. That's the key to it all. So I guess do your inner thinking there, your inner works. Kind of look at your business as a whole. Find out what I can do to make sure that even though I go through this, I don't miss anything on the bottom line, that I still have that 15% bottom line there at the end. And I think you're going to come out of this, you're going to be, obviously it's going to be tough, but you're going to come out of it doing pretty well.
I think it's a great closing thought, Jody. I think that a lot of times people are very stressed right now, and there's a lot going on both in our work lives and our personal lives that make it a lot harder. So I think that taking this time to build your business stronger is going to make future times like this a little less stressful. So I think it's a great tip, and I definitely would recommend taking that time right now to evaluate your business, because once you have those conversations, once you have those thoughts, it'll be amazing what you find and what your business is going to look like in the future. So great tip there, Jody.
Yep.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Jody, and hopefully the listeners enjoyed this topic, and hopefully it was helpful with these times right now.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Enjoyed this episode? Visit our website at summitcpa.net to get more tips and strategies for achieving virtual CPA success. We're here to be a resource in this ever-changing industry.